Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today and for checking online as well. Today we're going to present the results of study we did during the last year on effective risk communication practice for natural hazards. This study was contracted to ERG, and the ERG folks are going to present to you the results of the study. But I just want to give you, first let me introduce the ERG folks that are going to be presenting today. It's Jenny Helmick, Linda Girardi, and Chris Lamie. They're going to be presenting the results of the study. And I just want to give you a brief background on the study and why we decided to contract it out. So when I came on board in NOAA was 2016. We had just finished a study, and actually it was an overview of, let me just show it to you. It look familiar to most of the people, I think, that's in this room. So we had just finished the risk communication and behavior study, and this was an initiative from the Social Science Committee. This study actually looked at the practices and the literature review on risk communication. So what the studies that are out there, what do they say about risk and uncertainty communication, how people behave, what they are looking for when they want to trust and rely on the information they're receiving. So based on that study, we decided to move forward with something that is more practical to NOAA. It would be something that NOAA could actually use to, first of all, identify the needs that we have for risk communication and NOAA. What are our specific needs and our practices in different line offices? So we have the Weather Service, we have NOS. Everybody needs to communicate some uncertainty on all the information data that we generate. So what are the practices in general at NOAA and outside NOAA? So we have other agencies that also have to communicate uncertainties and risks, like, for example, FEMA. And do they have anything established? What are their practices? So identify any other federal agencies. And then after we conduct some interviews with those agencies, with internal and external stakeholders, what can we put together and put like a framework together for NOAA to use that information? And then how we can actually recommend improvements for NOAA-wide and each line office, how they could actually use that information. So now I think ERG is going to be talking about all the interviews, the entire work they did during this year and a half of work. And I think we have an executive summary and the guide that's going to be posted on our website, on the office, on the Chief Economist's website, so you can all have access. Thank you.
Hey, hi, this is Jenny Helmick from ERG, and I'm going to talk a bit about the methods that we use to achieve the goals of the project that we just heard about. We began by researching the risk and uncertainty communication that's conducted by NOAA as well as by other agencies. So first, we interviewed 20 people across NOAA's 6 line offices, which are the National Environmental Satellite Data and Information Service, NOAA Fisheries, NOAA Research, National Ocean Service, National Weather Service, Office of Marine and Aviation Operations. And we conducted these interviews either in person or via webinar, and they ranged from either one-on-one sessions to group discussions with 2 or 3 people. NOAA identified the interviewees for each line office, who included public affairs and communications specialists, managers and directors, and scientists. And the purpose of the interviews was to learn from each line office about their mission and how they characterize risks and hazards, the risk messaging approaches they take, who their stakeholders and partners are, their communications tools and channels that they use, messaging successes and challenges, and how they evaluate their risk communication activities. And we also talked with an additional 12 people external to NOAA. These included people in federal, state, and local government agencies, independent agencies and commissions, coastal and land use planners, broadcast meteorologists, and members of news organizations, scientists, and policy analysts. We interviewed these folks to better understand how they use NOAA risk and uncertainty information and services, and how they engage with NOAA staff. We also researched risk communication at other agencies to find out about their activities and best practices. And in addition to reviewing materials from these agencies, we interviewed 2 experts at Centers for Disease Control and the Food and Drug Administration who pioneered risk communication programs in their agencies and were able to share with us their experience and advice. And then a major part of the project involved developing a practical guide for communicating risk and uncertainty for natural hazards. And this became a 28-page, easy-to-use guide with steps and worksheets to help NOAA staff plan how they'll communicate about specific risks. And a little later in this presentation, we'll show you that guide and give a demo for how to use it. We also pilot tested a draft of the guide with representatives from all 6 line offices, and we asked them to try following all the instructions and filling out the worksheets. And they gave us a lot of great feedback, and which we used to improve the final product. A few words about the scope of this project. Early stages of the project focused on many types of risks. We had open-ended discussions with staff across NOAA about the types of risks that they were most concerned about. These included environmental risks, such as risks to ecosystems and marine life, say resulting from an oil spill, societal risks, such as impacts to people's quality of life because of coastal inundation, as an example, and economic risks, which involve losses to business and industries, such as losses resulting from overfishing. And those first 3 are external risks that NOAA addresses. And then we have what we could consider internal risks. That includes risks to NOAA's reputation or credibility, such as, say, from a storm forecast that doesn't pan out. And then finally, enterprise risks, which affect NOAA operations and ability to deliver data and services. Examples here might be risks related to the condition of the NOAA fleet or delays in a satellite launch. Now, as the project evolved, the NOAA project team encouraged us to focus the practical guide on communicating external risks. Internal risks have a lot of the same characteristics as external risks and involve many of the same communication strategies, but there are some critical differences, and we wanted to make it clear to users that the practical guide is really oriented toward communicating external risks. And the examples that we used in the guide have been chosen accordingly. And in particular, we're focusing on how NOAA communicates about the risks posed by natural hazards. So it does include topics like overfishing, which you might not think of strictly as a natural hazard. So NOAA's line offices address a wide range of hazards and associated risks. So everything from life-threatening weather events to hazards to ecosystems to long-term threats to communities and the economy. And you can see some examples here on the screen. In some cases, more than one office plays a role in characterizing and communicating a particular risk. So, for example, a large oil spill could require attention to weather and waves and currents, remote sensing, risk to fisheries and ecosystems, and involvement of NOAA vessels and emergency response personnel. So through conversations with staff across NOAA, we learned about all sorts of ways that the agency communicates about risk and uncertainty. We heard stories about times when risk communication went well and other times when staff encountered challenges that created learning opportunities. So for example, we heard about efforts to ensure consistent messaging to the public during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. This included using software tools to coordinate across multiple weather forecast offices, the Storm Prediction Center, and the National Hurricane Center. We heard about how NOAA communicates with congressional staff to explain risks and uncertainties associated with satellite missions. And we heard about how the National Ocean Service provides tools and training to address coastal issues. And to date, National Ocean Service has published 114 stories from the field that show how NOAA's partners have applied these resources across the country. And the example you see here is an interactive sea level rise viewer. And we learned about cases where risk communication challenges led to improvements. So, for example, we heard about a stranded whale on Long Island and a community that felt NOAA hadn't responded quickly enough. So NOAA held a community meeting, put a clearer incident command structure in place, and captured lessons learned in a new crisis communications guide. So now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Linda Girardi, who will talk about our research findings and recommendations.
Great, thanks, Jenny. So, and as Jenny mentioned, to begin this research, we started internally. We talked about 20 NOAA staff across the 6 line offices, and a number of key findings cross-cutting emerged. First, people had a lot of different opinions about the role of NOAA scientists in risk communication. We found that not all scientists or technical people feel comfortable communicating risk information or even see it as their responsibility. Some felt that engaging in communication can take time away from the science. Others felt that scientists are too in the weeds or they speak a different language. And some simply felt that NOAA just needed more communication experts or translators to explain the science rather than the scientists themselves. Second, explaining science to a lot of different audiences is not easy. And some of the issues relate to the data itself. Some line offices told us they're dealing with long-term risks. They may not be relevant for years, but their audiences need to make decisions today. And all line offices struggle with uncertainty, communicating uncertainty. Some noted that there are inconsistencies just in the way NOAA defines and communicates uncertainty, and that creates challenges. For example, what does a slight chance mean? That can mean different things to different offices and different people within NOAA. And then finally, resources are another challenge. Offices said that sometimes they lack expertise, funding, training, and resources to develop communication strategies and guidelines. Some offices need staff, not only those trained in risk communication, but they also need help with graphics and visualization and IT, all those services that support communication. Some have really good protocols, as you heard from Jenny, for risk communication with NOAA fisheries. Others are a little more unclear about who owns the message, and that's particularly true during a crisis. And then many also said that they really are not sure what resources are available internally. There probably are some, but they weren't quite sure what was available to help them build their capacity. Okay, turning to the external interviews, we found a number of, again, key findings. One of the first things that we heard, which is really great, is that NOAA is really a very trusted and credible risk information source. NOAA websites are highly utilized, and your external partners have noticed when you redesign your websites, and they feel that's really for the best. They love it. On the flip side, some felt that NOAA could be using technology better, could be making better use of more available interactivities and tools. Some also wanted more partner education, and this is especially true as NOAA develops new tools and resources. And along with that, they also suggested maybe NOAA needed to do a bit more to promote its resources. It has a lot of great tools and resources, but people don't necessarily know about them. And one solution that people put forth was that NOAA work more with its partners to promote tools and information. Another really positive thing we heard really from, I think, every person we talked to was that NOAA staff are great. They got a great deal of praise. People cited the easy access they had and the strong working relationships they have with NOAA staff. And then finally, many people outside of NOAA have seen how the agency's audience base has been expanding in recent years, encompassing more members of the public and also more partners. So they encourage NOAA to take steps to do more to better understand those diverse audiences and to customize your risk information to those audiences. And again, they suggested that NOAA partners are here to help do that and to translate and amplify that information. As Jenny mentioned, we also did some federal agency research and talked to a couple people in particular at CDC and FDA that were really very helpful. And so what we learned from them was one of the key things they suggested was important in building a risk communication program is leadership. Both CDC and FDA have very robust risk communication programs, and they both emphasized how important leadership support was for building those programs. They also talked about the importance of internal networks. Having champions and networks of people committed to risk communication within an agency is very helpful. FDA, for example, has a large internal work group that it uses to help monitor and track risk communication across the agency. Then integration. They also stressed risk communication, to be successful, needs to be integrated into people's jobs responsibilities, like a standard operating procedure. And one FDA spokesperson likened it to a seatbelt that you just use and don't think about. And to help make this reality, FDA offers risk communication training, general risk communication for anybody who wants to take it, as well as specific training for different groups using their own materials to help make it more relevant. Okay, so based on all that research, we came up with a few recommendations for strengthening risk and uncertainty communication at NOAA. And first thing is leadership, as we heard from FDA and CDC. It's real important that NOAA leadership is committed to the idea that risk communication is a legitimate activity and also provides resources to support those activities in the line offices. This commitment also has to be conveyed to all staff who have a role in risk communication. And leadership can really go a long way to building that culture at NOAA that embraces effective risk communication. Another recommendation has to do with planning and measurement. We heard that many staff internally struggle with measuring their impact. And one solution here might be to develop an agency-wide or line office-specific plan to formalize risk communication and establish metrics so you can measure progress. This has worked well at FDA. However, they also caution that keeping a plan current and tracking the activity across the agency that you need to inform that plan requires resources and committed people. Okay, third has to do with collaboration. As Jenny pointed out, a lot of NOAA's work is really interconnected among different line offices, and these connections may present a lot of really good opportunities for collaborating, so that if one office has really great risk communication experts in-house, they may be able to share that expertise with another office. And then uncertainty, again, as we heard, it is really a challenge to communicate uncertainty, especially with non-technical audiences. So here, one thing NOAA might consider is developing guidance to help frame uncertainty based on best practices. And that kind of guidance might help ensure consistency and prevent misunderstandings. And this is actually something we try to address and bring into the practical guide that Chris is going to talk about in just a minute. Okay, another recommendation is, as we heard, not everyone at NOAA is comfortable communicating risk information. So to help your staff become more effective communicators, we suggest NOAA establish internal processes for sharing resources, for building capacity, and helping staff measure their impacts. And also to consider ways that you can reward staff for their achievements and performance in risk communication. And then finally, our last recommendation, which is also related to building that staff capacity, concerns training. We heard lots of different training needs during our internal interviews, everything from risk communication boot camps to media training to social media training. But I would also say that external interviewees also brought up training and thought that training would be helpful so that risk communication is more thoroughly integrated with everyone's jobs responsibilities at NOAA. So I'm going to turn the presentation now over to Chris, who will talk about some of the outputs from the project.
Thank you, Linda. So we really had three main products at the end of the project here. The first is the final report. This report captures our findings and our recommendations in detail. That includes detailed notes from all the interviews and research we conducted, as well as plenty of other information that we compiled on best practices. Internal interviews were not always aware of all the NOAA resources available, so we made sure to create an annotated compilation of those resources in the final report. We also developed an executive summary. This is just a high-level summary of the project and its key findings. And we have the practical guide, as we've mentioned before. It's designed to be used by NOAA line offices or others, and it's really to respond to that need, that request for practical guidance. Let's talk a little bit more about that guide. Key components. The guide breaks the risk communication process down into a series of 8 planning steps. As examples from different parts of the agency, and each step has a corresponding worksheet. NOAA has many existing resources, but we know that some of them are specific to certain hazards, and others might be broader but might not be widely known outside of the office that created it. This guide helps to fill a gap by providing guidance that users can apply to a wide range of hazards. We also wanted to make sure we pointed readers to a lot of those existing resources. Another gap that was mentioned earlier was that there's not a lot of information on how to communicate uncertainty to different audiences. So we focused on capturing some best practices and resources here in the guide. How to use this guide? Well, it's designed for a team to actually sit down and plan out how they would communicate about a specific risk or set of risks. Worksheets are designed to be filled out. They can be filled out on paper or as electronic PDF fillable forms. And we have extra copies of those forms that are available at the same web location for anyone who wants to fill them out for multiple topics in one setting. If you do it with a team of people with a diversity of skill sets and areas of expertise, you'll be able to get a diversity of ideas and perspectives into the conversation, which can be really valuable. And through testing, we found that it can really take a few hours to go through all the steps and do it well. So we strongly encourage users to reserve a decent amount of time. Where to find it? Getting posted on the web. Should be publicly available soon, if not already. This next diagram is featured in the report, and this just lays out the 8 steps of risk communication. There is no one right way to do it, but this is a set of steps that's pretty well established and respected. The practical guide focuses on those 8 steps for creating an informed risk communication plan. In this case, we start from the center of our Nautilus diagram and spiral our way outward until we've implemented the plan and released our communications to the world. We recognize that it's very much an iterative process. There are plenty of cases where you might work your way back toward the center. For example, after you test your messages, you might find that you need to go back and improve the messages and how you're delivering them. It's also important to evaluate. So after you've implemented the plan and communicated, see how you did and improve if needed. We also wanted to make the point that it's really important that planning requires you to understand your audience. The best way to do this is through actually talking with your audience, two-way communication where you talk with them and listen. Listening is so critical to their perspectives, their concerns, and their needs for information. Now let's take a look at the guide. Moment, I'll screen. So here it is. It's 8 pages. So we really tried to strike a balance and provide enough information while still keeping it user-friendly. Show one page at a time. In our introduction, we include some key terms, just some definitions and examples to give everyone a consistent frame of reference for understanding the document. Different people talk about risk, hazard, or other key terms in different ways. So we wanted to get a common lexicon at the beginning. Here's our diagram again. And for each step, the guide provides some basic information and resources, followed by a worksheet. Characterize the risk. Right here on this page, we note questions to ask yourself. What is the hazard? Where is it? Who or what will be harmed? And so on. This step is really about making sure you have a scientific foundation for what you're going to communicate. It also includes thinking about some of the more subjective qualities that might affect the way people perceive risk. This table on the right shows some of the reasons why people might be more concerned about certain risks than others. For example, is it something that they have any control over, or is it completely external to them? Naturally occurring, is it familiar? Is it happening in the near term, or is it something happening off in the distant future? These and more are factors that the literature tells us affect the way people perceive risk. Now the box at the lower left, the blue box with the book icon, shows some resources, mostly within NOAA. And this box with the icon appears throughout the practical guide, flagging those resources that are already available. That brings us to the worksheet. As I mentioned, these are fillable forms, so we can identify a hazard. Let's say our hazard is overfishing. We have a risk. The example was harm to fish stocks, and we can fill that in. And as we fill it in, we can go down the list and answer each of the key questions, and then provide anything that you have, any data you have to quantify probability of occurrence or uncertainty associated with it. Page. Step 2 is to set goals for what you're trying to accomplish with your communication. We note 3 main types of goals, which could overlap. Some communication is designed to promote behavior change. Think about actions people can take to reduce their risk of drowning, for example. Some people call this care communication. Next is communication to encourage action in the face of imminent danger. This would be a tsunami warning or another type of hazard that requires immediate response. Some people call this crisis communication. Finally, we have communication to inform and encourage people to work together to reach decisions. An example would be projections that NOAA might provide that help coastal planners with adaptation and mitigation decisions. This is also called communication, consensus communication in the field. So we think about specific goals we want to achieve, and then in the worksheet we ask you to identify those goals in one or more of those areas, and then think of any challenges you might face in trying to achieve those goals. Those might include language barriers, level of trust, or differences in how people receive risk or perceive risk. Step 3 is about really getting to know your audiences, their needs, their characteristics, and their concerns. She asks you to answer a set of key questions from multiple audience groups. What do they care about? Whom do they trust? And think about how they tend to prefer to receive information, who's talking with them, any specific subpopulations with vulnerabilities, and so on. You'll fill that in and then move on to step 4, where we go into detail about how we create our messages. We present a lot of best practices related to the words you choose, the order you present them in, the length of your message, repetition, several other features. We also compare the pros and cons of different ways of presenting uncertainty. We look at numbers, we look at words, we look at graphics. Talk about some best practices for communicating uncertainty. And we realize this is really just scratching the surface, so we point to other resources that are available. But we talk about things like really understanding how much complexity the end user wants and needs. We don't want to overwhelm them with too much information that will just go over their heads. Know that it's okay to be really honest about what scientific knowledge is out there. It can change and evolve, but based on what we know today, so on. Knowledge discrepancies. We mentioned presenting uncertainty in the middle of the message. So you lead with what you know, establish common understanding, present the uncertainty, and then end with the most important point you want people to remember. By that, there's some interesting information in the table on the right on wording. If you think from the perspective of a scientist, you can think of what a term like error might mean, or bias. But now put yourself in the shoes of someone who's not a scientist at all. Those words can mean very different things. So we've provided a few examples here. There are many more things about what words you use in your message. Here in the worksheet, we create a message map. Provide key points and its supporting information to help answer each of those questions we anticipate. Step 5 challenges us to find the best ways to reach our audiences. So if we go to the worksheet, we see that for each audience, we want to think about how we'll convey the information. Will we be able to interact with them in person, through a website, through social media, through other tools or platforms? We want to think about what the message will look like. Will it be text? Will it be a graphic or video? Finally, we want to think about intermediaries. These are trusted messengers who can help. Somebody the audience already knows and trusts, a channel that already exists that you may be able to latch onto. 6 is really important because we need to test our messages. That's not just with your friends and family, but with people who actually resemble the audience that we're trying to reach. It prompts you to think about how you can engage a sample audience and what questions you can ask them. Step 7 challenges you to think about metrics. How are we going to measure the success of our risk communication efforts? Not always easy to do, especially if we're trying to measure behavior change. But what we talk about here are some ways that you can measure not only outputs, like what you produce, but also outcomes. How we've reached They understand it, and have they taken action? Are fewer deaths or injuries occurring? Worksheet prompts us to think about those questions, what metrics we would use, how we would collect the data, and how often those data can be collected. Finally, step 8 is to figure out who you're going to need on your team to turn this plan into action. Definitely need people with a wide variety of skills. This table lays out a few of those key areas. We need somebody to take leadership, someone with the authority to make decisions and to manage the project. We need people who are good at developing messages and outreach materials. So that includes web developers, graphic designers, social media experts, and others. People who are good at monitoring and evaluating communications so we know how we did. So that includes the metrics like we were just talking about. It includes web analytics and other forms of information. It really helps to have somebody who's good with media relations, press conferences, public speaking, skills in getting the word out through different media channels. And finally, it really helps to have good partner relationships, people who really know the stakeholders and are good at networking and connecting with them. Worksheet prompts us to think about all the different roles we need to fill on our team. What skills are needed for each of those roles? Who on our team, who on your team has those skills? And if you don't have a fit yet, what could you do to get that fit? Maybe it's some additional training that somebody can take to become more proficient in one of these areas, or maybe it's a way that you can get help from another office or another place outside, a partner who can help to fill one of these roles. That brings us to the practical guide. Those are the worksheets, and as I mentioned, the worksheets themselves are also available as a separate file, so you can fill out as many copies as you need. I have citations here at the end. Plenty of other resources and references are in the guide that Monica mentioned at the beginning. A lot of those best practices have been compiled, as well as in our final report. So with that, now that we've shown you the pieces, happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you everyone online and in person for coming. Do you have any questions? Let's take in person first. Okay. Online, we did have a few questions. A few people did go to the performance.NOAA website and did not see that the guide was posted yet. Do we know when it will be posted? Okay, within the week. Awesome. And we did have one other question. Yes, publicly available. Okay, Chris, Jenny, Linda, in your research, did you encounter situations where deterministic communication of risk was more appropriate than communicating probabilities?
Yeah, so this is Linda. I can't say that that actually came up specifically. I mean, it feels like, especially with the folks we talked to in the National Weather Service, that there was more of an inclination to be moving to more probabilistic communication than deterministic. So I guess that didn't really specifically come up as a conversation. Now, I would say, based on what we heard, that so much risk communication is really determined by your audience and what their needs are and their comfort levels and what makes most sense to them, so that there may be audiences and situations where there is some deterministic communication that would be appropriate. And, Harvey might be a really good example of that, because it was a really good forecast, and Weather Service and SPC, WPC knew for days out that there was going to be an awful lot of rainfall. And so we did hear from, in fact, the WFO there, that they were not really caging their messaging too much. They were actually saying, hey, this is going to happen, be prepared.
Okay, thank you, Linda. We do have a request, Chris, if you could go back to the slide that has the link to the guide.
Absolutely. Actually, our next slide has that too, where the guide and those other resources are available.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. We do have a couple more questions about your interviewees. Can you tell us how many people you interviewed from the National Weather Service?
Boy, I think there were 4 people from the National Weather Service, so the interviews ranged from 2 to 4 people, and we had quite a few people from the Weather Service, both from headquarters and then also from a local office.
Okay, thank you. Also in interviews, did you interview high-level partners like emergency managers in big cities, and if so, does the report cover that? Right.
So we only interviewed 10 people. We're trying to get a cross-section across the different line offices. We did interview an emergency manager in particular, actually not from a big city, but from a smaller county. But we did try to look across and get as good of a cross-section as we could, given sort of the time constraints and the budget of the project.
And the final report lists all of the specific interviewees we interacted with. They included emergency managers, person at a city, some state personnel, even TV broadcasters with some sort of particular interest in Spanish language broadcasting.
Right. And actually, that's a good point. The broadcast meteorologist that we talked to, was really actually representing a pretty national scope. So that was the other thing we really tried to get at, was everything from a pretty local to state to national, federal level. So, there were some constraints to how many people we could talk to, but we tried to get a good cross-section, both looking at it from a geographical perspective as well as these different levels of partners that NOAA interacts with.
Okay, thank you. Then follow-up, do you have plans to do additional interviews from other line offices or into the future?
That would be a question for NOAA. I think that our work is pretty much complete. We did finish up, and the project is winding to an end. But I think that would be kind of a question for NOAA if additional research or add-on kind of work would be necessary or viable or useful from their end.
And it also might be wonderful to, at a certain point going out, evaluate how the practical guide has been used and how it might be improved as well.
Do we have a question in the room?
Yeah, Kate Weatherstone. So I have a question focused a bit on the metrics piece, which was kind of one of the number 2 recommendation listed. Essentially, in the interviews, were there any trends or common ground regarding metrics of risk communication that was pulled from either externally or internally, and are they covered in the guide?
Could you guys hear the question?
Yeah, could you summarize that a little bit? Was it asking about metrics in the guide?
Metrics and trends, if you noticed any of those, and if they are in the guide.
Chris, do you want to speak to the guide? I can speak to the interviews. I think what we heard from the interviews was that measurement is really pretty challenging, and the way that people tend to try to measure their impact right now is, somewhat anecdotally. A lot of it has to do with what kind of feedback people are getting from their partners. And sometimes actually not getting feedback can be a good thing. Like if you're not being called to testify to Congress, one person said that actually is a good thing. But I think we also heard from another person that there's a lot of stories and a lot of anecdotal information, and that tends to be what people kind of try to collect as far as measuring their communication impact and how well that they are doing. Now, I will say that, I kind of a pioneer out there in National Ocean Service, the Office for Coastal Management. They do some more specific measurement. They do quite a bit of training, and so what they will do is they'll send out an evaluation after they have done the training, but they'll also do another level of, they'll go back out after 3 months and reach out to those training participants to see if they have taken the information that they've gotten from the training and applied it to their job. And I believe they go out again in another 3 months and go back and follow up with those same attendees to again see if they have, gained knowledge and actually applied it to their situation. So I think what we're seeing with metrics is that, and they can be very, getting, how many people have downloaded a document or how many hits to your website really doesn't tell you how well you're doing. It only gives you, a pretty broad perspective of who you might be reaching. But you really have to do these kinds of additional follow-on work, surveys. The National Weather Service does a lot of surveys to really gauge how their products are being used and whether there needs to be improvements. And getting to those outcomes, whether you are making a difference, having an impact, can be more challenging. It can take more time. It can take more money. But certainly there are offices that are doing that. Does that help address that question?
Yes, thank you. Chris, did you want to add on to that?
I can just say that we, I wouldn't say we found any overarching trends or patterns, but as Linda said, there are definitely some folks who are doing this well and continuing to strive to do better. In the practical guide, we don't get into a great amount of detail on metrics, but we do mention, as Linda said, that beyond just measuring outputs, it is really important to try to find a way to measure outcomes. And we've included some questions that you could ask as part of an evaluation, along with some suggestions, both from the literature and from the interviews. As Linda mentioned, interviews, surveys, also focus groups, observation, and other analysis.
Yeah, and we try to be sensitive to the fact that, measuring outcomes can be a huge effort. It's its own art and science, so that we try to identify a process where you look at, so what are the key questions you want to evaluate about your risk communication, and then from there work backwards to identify metrics. And then, as in other sections of the guide, we evaluated other resources that you can see in that blue box with the book icon that you can turn to for more guidance.
And this included a resource from the food, because this was one case. Everybody struggles with this this issue, so we found some good information from another agency that we thought would be worth pointing.
Right, and then I would just say too, that's the idea of maybe a plan, and different offices have different needs, and because it is timely and cost effective, as Jenny said, really figuring out what are you trying to achieve and what should you measure. Like the two go hand in hand. And so that's where you may want to invest your time and resources, and is, if there's one person said, if there's a really high impact event too, you might do some media monitoring and see what people are saying. So it really depends on, the situation, the line office, and what you're trying to achieve and what's important for you to measure.
This is a step that tends to get short shrift in sort of across the board, across agencies, with some exceptions. So we try to emphasize its importance in the entire process.
Okay, thank you. I don't think we have any more questions in the room or online. That PDF to the practical guide will be up within the week, we hope. And thank you guys so much. Do you have anything you want to say? Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.